The 16th and 17th centuries were the formative 200 years leading to the creation of the United States of America. They started with Spanish conquistadors exploring the southeastern United States and ended with 12 English colonies firmly in place along the Atlantic seaboard, in place with well-established ideals of self-governance, democracy, and religious tolerance. It was right here at this point on the U.S. Virgin Islands that Christopher Columbus made landfall on his second voyage to the New World. 425 years later, these islands would become part of the United States of America, a country that would spring from the greatest colonization effort the world has ever seen, the colonization of the North American continent. A year earlier, Columbus had embarked on his first journey of discovery. Columbus himself was a man of mystery whose origins are still debated today. The legend has it that Columbus had to convince King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella of Spain to outfit 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and his own flagship, the Santa Maria, for a voyage west to find the Far East. It was a daring plan, since at this time other nations were sailing east around Africa, looking for a sea route to India and China. As a result, Columbus blazed the most famous sea route in history, the route to the New World. And his voyages would lead directly to the colonization of North America. It started on August 3, 1492, when Columbus sailed from Palos, Spain. 69 days later, he and his crew landed at the present-day island of San Salvador. Columbus thought he had made it to India, and even named the Caribbean islands the Indies. Now looking for gold, Columbus traveled from San Salvador to present-day Cuba, then Haiti and the Dominican Republic. On March 15, 1493, Columbus completed his journey and returned to Spain. His next voyage took him to the U.S. Virgin Islands, where he interacted with the native islanders. On his third voyage, May 1498 to October 1500, Columbus sailed to Trinidad and then to Venezuela. On his fourth and final trip, May 1502 to November 1504, Columbus sailed to Honduras, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and Panama. Following Columbus's last voyage, Spanish conquistadors spread out through the southern part of North America, beginning with Ponce de Leon, landing in Florida in 1509. Other European nations followed: England, France, the Netherlands, and Sweden. It was an effort that would span more than 200 years, colonize a vast, untamed land, and ultimately lead to the founding of the United States of America. The beaches of Florida's Atlantic coast are now home to vacationers escaping the harsh winters of the north. But the first Europeans to set foot upon these pristine sands were Hispanic explorers nearly 500 years ago. Indeed, a map of the southern coastline of the United States reveals a legacy of Hispanic names: St. Augustine, Punta Gorda, Pensacola, Galveston, Corpus Christi. These places were named by intrepid Hispanic explorers who sought not only a western sea passage to China, but land for colonies, colonies that would enable Spain to settle the New World Christopher Columbus had discovered. Among the first of these explorers was Juan Ponce de Leon, the first European to set foot upon the southern coast of what would become the United States of America. Ponce de Leon was born in Santervas, Spain, around 1460 and fought in the wars to oust the Moors from Granada in southern Spain. In 1493, he joined Columbus's second expedition to the West Indies, staying in the Caribbean where he joined the ranks of the Hispanic conquistadors, who sought their fortunes in the New World. Conquistadors were military leaders who invaded foreign lands and conquered the inhabitants. Ponce de Leon was part of a tradition that went back thousands of years to men like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and William the Conqueror. When Ponce de Leon heard of gold on the neighboring island of Puerto Rico, he organized an expedition to the island and conquered it. Appointed governor in 1509, he established the oldest European settlement on the island. 4 years later, Ponce de Leon outfitted another military expedition to find the island of Bimini in the Bahamas. Along the way, he landed on the east coast of Florida at what was to become St. Augustine and claimed the territory for Spain. He named this land La Florida in honor of the Easter Sunday known as Pascua de Florida, Feast of Flowers. Later it was shortened to Florida when it became the United States' 27th state. Supposedly, Ponce de Leon was searching for the lost fountain of youth. Perhaps associated with one of Florida's many spectacular springs, the fountain of youth was said to give everlasting life and health to whomever drank from its miraculous waters. But such tales are fanciful. Like the conquistadors at this time, Ponce de Leon was searching for gold. Although he did not find any, he did find something just as valuable: the Gulf Stream current. In the decades that followed, Spanish galleons loaded with treasure from Mexico and Peru would use the Gulf Stream in their return journeys to Spain. Ponce de Leon tried twice more to find the island of Bimini, but was unsuccessful. On his last expedition in 1521, he and a force of 200 men landed on the west coast of Florida. Native American warriors attacked them, and Ponce de Leon was wounded by an arrow. He later died from his wounds in Havana, Cuba, in July 1521. He is now buried in San Juan, Puerto Rico. Today, the southeastern United States is the core of the Deep South and former stronghold of the Confederacy. Now tens of millions of people live and work there. But 500 years ago, it was home to swamps, marshes, primeval forests, and fierce Indian tribes. It was a mysterious and unknown area no Hispanic conquistador dared to explore. Yet one man, a man in the tradition of Spain's warrior explorers, would lead an expedition through this untamed wilderness for 3 years. That man was Hernando de Soto, perhaps the most famous European explorer since Marco Polo. In fact, throughout the southeastern U.S., many towns and counties carry his name. In an expedition that would not be rivaled until 260 years later by Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery, De Soto led a force of 600 men across 10 southern states and even as far north as Indiana and Michigan. But it was here in present-day Florida that he came ashore in 1539 to begin his expedition, seeking his fortune and glory for Spain. By 1530, Spain's first generation of conquistadors, led by Hernán Cortés, expanded her western empire to include all of Mexico and Central America, where they found immense riches in gold and silver. Then, enticed by rumors of golden cities, lost empires, and immense treasures that lay in the unexplored regions of North and South America, the conquistadors sought even greater wealth. The result was that a second generation of explorer warriors, men like Francisco Pizarro, Francisco Coronado, and Hernando de Soto, were driven to explore these regions and see what was there. The greatest of these explorers was De Soto, the man responsible for claiming the southeastern United States for Spain. De Soto was born around 1500 in Spain. At the age of 14, he traveled to the West Indies, where in 1531 he joined Francisco Pizarro in his assault on the Incan Empire. During this expedition, Pizarro made De Soto his second in command. With his share of the treasure, 18,000 ounces of gold, De Soto returned to Spain in 1535. He settled down in Seville and became a wealthy gentleman. But his retirement did not last long. Spurred by twin dreams of finding gold in Florida and a northwest sea passage to China, he sold all his property and prepared an expedition to the New World. In 1537, Spain's King Charles I made De Soto governor of Cuba, granted him the right to conquer Florida, and gave him the right to choose any land he wished in Florida for his own plantation. 2 years later, De Soto was ready to fulfill his dream when he arrived on Florida's west coast, May 30th, 1539. For the next 4 years, his incredible expedition of discovery covered more than 4,000 miles, exploring the southeastern part of what would become the United States, including Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, Missouri, and Louisiana. But he also crossed the Ohio River into Indiana and Michigan. De Soto maintained meticulous records, providing the only first-hand detailed accounts of the immense cities of the mound builders' vast empire and powerful Indian tribes. De Soto's expedition used the phases of the moon as a means of dating the expedition's events and findings. This novel time dating would make it possible for anyone reading the journals at a later date to know exactly where and when the expedition made its important discoveries. De Soto never found gold or a northwest passage to China. At the same time, the expedition's contacts with the native tribes were disastrous, leading to continuous warfare with everyone the Spanish met. Finally, in June 1542, De Soto succumbed to a fever and died on the banks of the Mississippi River, where he was buried. Interestingly, 200 years after De Soto's expedition, these Indian cities and tribes had vanished when Europeans once more returned to the area. What De Soto had described, the powerful Mississippian Indian culture, had been replaced with new cultures such as Choctaw, Cherokee, and Creek. As a result, De Soto was for a long time denied just credit for the scope of his remarkable journey of discovery. Though De Soto's expedition ended disastrously, of the 600 men who started out, less than 300 survived. What did survive were his journals, providing a unique early account of a region that would become part of the Spanish Empire and eventually the American South. In fact, so great an American hero was De Soto to Walter P. Chrysler that in 1928, the U.S. automaker named one of his premier model lines De Soto to honor the famous explorer. The great American desert Southwest called to the last of the conquistadors, the last of the warrior explorers who made the harrowing journey across the Atlantic Ocean to find fortune in an untamed new world. More than 200 years would pass before French or English adventurers would set foot again on the lands he discovered for Spain. Because of his daring, Spain would enlarge its holdings in North America to include Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, and California. He was Francisco Vázquez de Coronado. By 1540, Spain had increased its presence in the New World so that it now included all of Mexico, Central America, and portions of South America. But Spain's conquistadors were still not through exploring. Hernando de Soto was already trekking through the southeastern half of North America. At the same time, the Southwest, with its rumors of easy wealth, beckoned Francisco Coronado to his date with destiny. Coronado was born into a noble family in Salamanca, Spain in 1510. At the age of 25, he sailed to Mexico as an assistant to its new viceroy, Don Antonio de Mendoza. He settled in Mexico City, where he married the daughter of the colonial treasurer and became a governor of the province of Nueva Galicia in 1538. It was from here that he would begin the expedition that would bring him everlasting fame as well as disappointment. Rumors of the golden cities of Cibola and Quivira had circulated through Mexico since Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztecs in 1521. Then in 1539, new accounts of these mysterious cities of gold came from Fray Marcos de Niza, a priest who, with an African slave known as Esteban, had trekked through the southwest and told of rich kingdoms with elephants, camels, and incredible riches. In 1540, Coronado was determined to make one last grand discovery for Spain, seeking the fabled golden cities of Cibola. So he led an expedition of 300 Spanish adventurers, 1,000 Indian allies, and 1,500 pack animals into the southwestern deserts and southern plains of North America. For the next 2 years, he traveled through New Mexico, Oklahoma, Texas, and into eastern Kansas. At one point, he and his men were within a couple hundred miles of Hernando de Soto's expedition. Had the two explorers met up, the history of North America might have been very different. At the same time, Melchior Diaz, one of Coronado's captains, journeyed up the Colorado River from the Gulf of California and sent expeditions as far west as the Imperial Valley region of present-day California. However, Coronado's expedition, like De Soto's, would not discover any golden cities or mineral wealth. But the Chronicle of Coronado's adventure, published after his death, provided information about an area of the New World not traversed again until the 18th century, when the French Malay brothers entered the Rocky Mountains in 1741. By this time, Coronado's exploits had led Spain to colonize the land north of the Rio Grande River, from Texas west to California. Finally, in 1848, Coronado's land of discovery would become part of the United States of America. Though Coronado returned to Mexico empty-handed, he continued to be a man of influence in Mexico City until his death in 1554 from injuries sustained during his 1540 expedition. This massive Spanish fort, Castillo de San Marcos, was built from 1672 to 1695 in order to protect the oldest permanent European settlement in the United States. Indeed, 55 years before the Pilgrims celebrated the first Thanksgiving and 211 years before the creation of the United States, an energetic and far-seeing Hispanic naval officer, Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles, along with 800 soldiers and settlers, landed on the east coast of Florida at this spot. That year, 1565, they founded St. Augustine and established the first colony in what would later become the United States of America. In spite of 70 years of Caribbean colonization, the North American continent still remained unsettled. That would change through the unsurpassed efforts of one man, Don Pedro Menendez de Aviles. Don Pedro was a naval officer who did not see Spain's invasion of North America the way the conquistadors did. He saw it as a place of permanent settlement. Interestingly, though Florida had been claimed by Spain in 1513 by Ponce de Leon, and again in 1539 by Hernando de Soto, she still had not established any colonies on this part of the North American mainland. However, that changed when France founded the St. Caroline Colony on Florida's St. John's River in 1564. The colony's fort threatened Spain's treasure ships, which sailed along Florida's shoreline returning to Spain. Spain's King Philip II sent his highest admiral, Menendez, and 2,000 sailors, soldiers, and their families to Florida with orders to colonize the land and drive out pirates and settlers of other nations. The plan was for the Spanish Armada to sail up Florida's St. John's River and attack the French colony directly. However, the French had blockaded the river. Menendez and his troops were forced to land at a smaller harbor south of St. Caroline. Menendez called this new landing St. Augustine. But Menendez's troubles with the French were not over. The French explorer Jean Ribault gathered his ships to attack the Spanish colony. But a storm wrecked his ships at present-day Daytona Beach. Taking advantage of this situation, Menendez and 500 men attacked the French fort at St. Caroline and killed all the soldiers, letting only the women and children go free. Now Menendez began to settle the land in earnest. He explored the area and set up a string of forts along Florida's coastline. He made diplomatic treaties with more of the Indian tribes, trading for much-needed supplies. At the same time, Menendez invited missionaries to establish missions throughout Florida to convert the Native Americans to the Catholic faith. He also built outposts on St. Helena Island in South Carolina and on Chesapeake Bay. Menendez left Florida in 1567 and returned once more in 1571. He died in Spain on September 17, 1574. But his vision left a unique Spanish legacy in Florida that can still be experienced in the city he founded, St. Augustine, a city that, along with its fort, protected Spain's colonies in the Caribbean from English invaders well into the 17th century. Roanoke Colony is the greatest of the 16th century's mysteries. An entire colony of 117 English settlers vanished without a trace. But its true importance transcends the mystery. Roanoke was the brainchild of one of England's most leading visionaries, Sir Walter Raleigh. Indeed, without Raleigh's drive to colonize, England might never have settled the Atlantic seaboard and gone on to dominate North America. Ever since Spain had sent back news of fabulous riches in the New World, all Europe had been ablaze with thoughts of the wealth that must lie there, ripe for the plucking. A few bold mariners, such as England's Sir Francis Drake, were plundering the Spanish treasure fleets crossing the Atlantic from the Caribbean. But the drive to settle North America would fall to Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh was one of the 16th century swashbuckling heroes. Born in 1552, he became an explorer, soldier, and writer. At the age of 28, he gained the favor of England's most far-seeing monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. He soon convinced the Queen that England needed a permanent North American settlement, funneling riches back to the mother country. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Raleigh a charter to colonize North America and establish a base from which to raid Spanish treasure fleets. Raleigh's first expedition left England in April 1585. It established a colony on Roanoke Island in Pamlico Sound, in present-day North Carolina. Raleigh called the region Virginia in honor of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. But struck with sickness and fear, The survivors returned to England in 1586 with Sir Francis Drake, who had been marauding Spanish ports in the Caribbean. Undaunted, Raleigh sent a second expedition a year later. The group of 117 colonists included 17 women and landed at the same place on Roanoke Island. At first, it did better than the original colony, but the invasion of England by the Great Spanish Armada in 1588 delayed much-needed supplies. When a supply ship returned in 1590, all of the settlers had vanished, and the only clue to their whereabouts was a post with the single word Croatoan carved into the wood. As a result, the 16th century would close with no English colony in North America. But thanks to Raleigh's vision, that would soon change with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. Today, the United States is an economic powerhouse, a corporate-based economic powerhouse. That heritage can be traced back to the first permanent English settlement in North America, Jamestown Colony. By the end of the 16th century, the outlook for English colonization in North America was bleak. Her first efforts at settlement failed when Sir Walter Raleigh's Roanoke Colony vanished into thin air in 1590. Indeed, England was on the brink of being shut out of North America altogether, when a daring and innovative business idea, hatched by London merchants, changed the course of history. In 1606, these merchants formed a joint stock company in order to spread the financial risk in a colonizing venture to Virginia. Calling themselves the Virginia Company of London, the merchants profited or lost according to the amounts of shares they owned. By spreading the risk, they could invest without having to gamble their entire fortunes. So brilliant was this novel scheme that it would set the stage for English colonization in North America and ultimately become the basis of American life, commerce, and even government. In December 1606, the London Company sent 100 settlers, all men, on ships like these to make the hazardous journey to the New World. The following May, these colonists sailed up the James River and established Jamestown. The plan was to build a settlement and at the same time look for a route to the Pacific Ocean and to prospect for gold. From the beginning, the new colony was beset by problems. The heavily forested land was swampy and a haven for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. The colonists neglected the necessary tasks of planting, plowing, and building to make a successful colony. Instead, they spent their efforts searching for gold. Jamestown was on the brink of disaster, and the joint stock company was about to fail when two young men turned the London Company's fortunes around. They were planter John Rolfe and Captain John Smith. By 1608, the 27-year-old Smith took over command of the Virginia colony. Born in 1580, he was a soldier who had fought the Ottoman Turks in Hungary. He mapped the area and overawed the Indians, obtaining from them food that kept the settlers from starving. He ended the mad scramble for gold, forcing the men to build fortifications and plant Indian corn. John Smith's efforts saved the settlement, and over the next 6 years, it gradually spread up the shores of the James River. Though the colony was beginning to prosper, and life, though difficult, was becoming more normal, the colony remained on the verge of economic failure for its London investors. There was no money-making trade to send back home. Then in 1612, John Rolfe found a way to make a profit. He knew that a product grown in the New World was sweeping through Europe, creating smoke shops. It was tobacco. By adapting a Caribbean island strain of tobacco to Virginia's climate, he produced a profit. As a result, the Virginia Company was able to shore up its investment and embark on a new round of immigration to the colony. The Joint Stock Company became the model for English colonization, ultimately leading to control of the North American continent and to the founding of the United States of America. In short, the Virginia Company's incredible economic success story would define one half of the American character, in the same way that colonial growth towards self-government would define the other half. The colonists' journey was arduous, the days long and grueling, through a sun-drenched, dry and barren desert, through lands occupied by Indian tribes who viewed travelers with suspicion, to a destination they could not be certain would support them and their families. And yet these brave Hispanic men and women would succeed against famine, drought, and Indian raids to found a thriving settlement. That settlement would grow to become a jewel in Spain's imperial crown, Santa Fe. Today, visitors easily travel through New Mexico's magnificent scenery. It is the region of breathtaking landscapes and remnants of ancient cultures. And it is still home to Native American pueblos. But 400 years ago, it was a wild and untamed land that the first Hispanic colonists encountered. There was no guarantee they would succeed. In 1540, Francisco Coronado went through northern New Mexico looking for the golden city of legend, Cibola. Though he never found any gold, Coronado repeated tales of wealth that were to be found in northern New Mexico. Then 55 years later, in 1595, Spain's King Philip II commissioned a Mexican silver mine owner, Juan de Oñate, to colonize New Mexico and spread Catholicism among the Native Americans. He also named Oñate governor of the colony. 3 years later, Oñate, an explorer warrior in the mold of Cortez and Coronado, led a group of 500 soldiers, colonists, and Franciscan friars along with 7,000 head of cattle north from Zacatecas in central Mexico across the Rio Grande River to New Mexico. By July 1598, the colonists established the first capital of New Mexico at San Gabriel Pueblo in the northern Rio Grande Valley and immediately began building missions to convert the Indians. Like the English colonists at Jamestown, which followed 9 years later in 1607, Oñate's expedition was split into two factions. Historian James E. Ivey described the first faction as entrepreneurs who hoped to make a profit trading with the Indians and prospecting for gold. The other faction consisted of true colonists who hoped to set up ranches and farms and start a thriving settlement. Conditions at first were harsh. Cold weather and short food supplies made survival difficult. As governor, Juan de Oñate's military leadership was overbearing. As a result, the settlers' faction broke from the group and petitioned to establish a new capital away from the San Gabriel Pueblo. The leadership of the settlers is shrouded in mystery. Most likely, he was a Castilian-born adventurer, Juan Martinez de Montoya, a man described as tall, of good feature, black-bearded. He served as a captain under Oñate and was named alcalde, or mayor of San Gabriel. The surviving records of the time report that early in 1608, he founded a settlement at Santa Fe called Plaza de Santa Fe. That same year, A new governor was appointed for New Mexico, and Juan de Oñate was ordered home. The new governor, Don Pedro de Peralta, was ordered to establish Montoya's Santa Fe settlement as the capital of New Mexico. Sometime in 1609, the new capital was named La Villa Real de la Santa Fe, or the Royal City of the Holy Faith. With its founding, the survival of the New Mexico colony was assured. Santa Fe went on to prosper and become a leading city in Spain's northern provinces. But friction between the Hispanics and Pueblo Indians continued to increase. In 1680, the Pueblos, led by a charismatic chief, Pope, attacked the Spanish settlers and missionaries. Over 400 were killed. The survivors fled south to present-day El Paso, Texas, where they founded new settlements and missions. Hispanic control was not regained until 1692, when the New Mexican governor, Diego de Vargas, recaptured Santa Fe. By the time the Santa Fe Trail opened in 1821, the city had indeed fulfilled the dream of those early colonists, a flourishing model of Hispanic business, trading, and ranching enterprises. The name most Americans remember her by is Pocahontas. It was a nickname meaning the naughty one or spoiled one. Her real name was Matoaka. She was the daughter of Powhatan, leader of the powerful Powhatan Confederacy of Indian nations. Yet, just as important, she was a Renaissance woman. A woman who saw that working with the English colonists might improve life for her people. At the time of the arrival of the English at Jamestown in 1607, a chief known as Powhatan ruled the nation, covering 1/5 of present-day Virginia and part of North Carolina. His chiefdom was part of a political renaissance among American Indian nations of the eastern woodlands. A renaissance that saw the emergence of coalitions such as the Powhatan Confederacy, leagues of friendship such as the Iroquois League, and alliances based on a common language and interests like the Algonquin Confederacy. The English landing at Jamestown troubled Pocahontas' father, Powhatan, and his followers, many of whom recalled violent encounters with Spanish conquistadors. Tensions between the English newcomers and the Indians quickly grew toward war. The English wanted the Indians to work for them, growing and harvesting corn. Powhatan and others saw the English as invaders who must be stopped. Tensions came to a head when Captain John Smith, a leader of the Jamestown Colony, was captured. Legend has it that Powhatan decided to kill the strange white man and send a message to the English. According to Smith, he was dragged before the chief, his head laid upon a rock. At that moment, Pocahontas risked her life to stop the execution. Whether or not the legend is true, Pocahontas' actions initiated a change in the point of view of her father. Clearly, in the years that followed, Pocahontas became a true Renaissance figure. She single-handedly pushed for cooperation between the whites and the Indians. A cooperation that would lead to the success of Jamestown, and from there, ultimately, to the making of the United States of America. Pocahontas would go on to be baptized as a Christian and take on the English name, Rebecca. She married John Rolfe, a leading figure of the Jamestown Colony. Their marriage would bring a period of peace between the colonists and the Powhatan Confederacy. The period lasted only 8 years, but it was enough time for the faltering colony to become firmly established through the growing of tobacco. In the spring of 1616, Rolfe took Pocahontas to England. There she was feted as an Indian princess, met King James I, and bore Rolfe a son. In March of 1617, at the age of 21, Pocahontas became ill and died before she could return to her homeland. She was buried in England. In her short life, Pocahontas was a remarkable Renaissance woman who showed friendship to the white settlers. In the 21st century, New York City is a teeming metropolis of more than 8 million people. It is home to numerous art galleries, museums, theaters, and it is the world's commercial and financial center. 400 years ago, it began as a dream in the eye of the Dutch West India Company. In 1609, Henry Hudson, an English navigator working for the Netherlands, sailed on his ship the Half Moon up the Hudson River, looking for a route to Asia. What he found instead was a remarkably fertile river valley, rich with furs, and having a natural harbor at its mouth into the Atlantic. 5 years later, Dutch explorer Adrian Blok's map of North America claimed present-day New York as New Netherlands for the Netherlands. But a claim for territory also required settlement. So in May of 1624, the Dutch West India Company landed 30 families on modern-day Governor's Island. More families followed, and the following year, Fort Amsterdam was built on Manhattan Island. The year after that, according to tradition, the colony's Director General, Peter Minuit, purchased Manhattan Island from the Lenape Indians for $24 in trade goods. In 1636, Minuit would go on to found North America's first Swedish colony at present-day Wilmington, Delaware. Indeed, with the French to the northwest, the English to the north and south, and the Spanish in Florida, what was to become the United States of America was already a melting pot of different cultures. From the start, New Netherlands was conceived as a utopian colony, where people were free to practice their religion and live by their consciences. Indeed, this would lead to the government of New Netherlands granting full citizenship to Jewish settlers in 1655. The Dutch held on to New Netherlands for 40 years. Then in 1664, Charles II of England sent 4 English frigates into New Amsterdam's harbor and demanded New Netherlands surrender. The Dutch Director General, Peter Stuyvesant, negotiated good terms, managing to preserve the utopian aspect of the Dutch governing principles, which assured New Netherlanders that they shall keep and enjoy the liberty of their consciences and religion. Ultimately, these early Dutch codes would become a part of the American fabric of diversity and liberty. Charles II gave New Netherlands to his brother James, the Duke of York, to rule. In 1675, the name was changed to New York. In 1607, men, Englishmen, boarded ships like these. They were bound for the New World, the mid-Atlantic coast. 100 years later, at the beginning of the 18th century, their numbers would grow to over 250,000 spread out over 12 colonies. During that span of time, these forerunners of the United States would learn how to survive in a hostile and foreign environment, create many experiments in representative government, build a legal system, and fight wars. They would also show great religious tolerance and great religious intolerance, show intense loyalty to the English monarchy, and engage in treasonous behavior. In these first 100 years, the foundation for the grand adventure in self-government would be laid by those who rode the seas to places like Plymouth Plantation and Jamestown. The first permanent English settlement in America was Jamestown. It was a business venture of the Virginia Company. But unlike the Spanish and Portuguese explorers to the south and the French to the north, the Virginia colonists found no wealth in gold or furs. But this lack of easy wealth was a blessing, forcing the colonists by their own enterprise to create that wealth through independent commerce and industry. Who were these early business adventurers? They were drawn from every class, noblemen and younger aristocratic sons who had few chances for land and power in England, investors and merchants, middle-class sons who wanted a new start, and then there were the poor who came as indentured servants. Life for these settlers was a struggle. Many died from disease and starvation. In fact, Jamestown was on the brink of failure when in 1614 John Rolfe sent the first shipment of tobacco to England, marking the beginning of a lucrative industry. In that same year, private ownership of land was instituted for the settlers. Private land ownership would become the cornerstone of American democracy. Indeed, for many years, land ownership determined who had the right to govern. In 1619, now on their way to establishing a flourishing tobacco industry, Virginia planters held the first legislative assembly in the New World. Called the House of Burgesses, its members passed their first laws that same year. It marked the beginning of democratic representative government. In the years that followed, Virginia would become a leader for independence and democracy in the colonies. It was from the House of Burgesses that Patrick Henry delivered his famous speech that included his immortal phrase for freedom: "Give me liberty or give me death." The greatest difference between the immigrants from England and those from other European countries was in the religious diversity of its settlers. This religious diversity included Quakers, Catholics, and many denominations of Protestants. But the most significant of these were the Puritans. In 1620, they arrived on the Mayflower at Plymouth Plantation, which later became known as Massachusetts Bay Colony. The beliefs and practices of the Puritans profoundly shaped what would become the American character and were the wellspring of American ideals: liberty, human rights, self-government, education, and intellectual thought. As nonconformists, the Massachusetts Puritans were constantly at odds with the monarchy. In the 17th century, Massachusetts Bay routinely ignored dictums from London. Indeed, Massachusetts became the early hotbed of revolution as America moved further towards self-government. However, Puritanism had its extremist dark side. Puritans were religious bigots who murdered Quakers and burned witches at Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. But in a curious way, the Puritans' religious persecution fostered religious tolerance in other colonies such as Rhode Island, Maryland, and Pennsylvania. In fact, this religious turmoil and diversity of early colonial America produced the two most important pieces of American democracy: the separation of church and state, and freedom of speech and expression of ideas. Ignored by London, the colonists quickly developed ideas of self-government. It was in Maryland, one of the religiously tolerant colonies, that a prototype of the U.S. Constitution emerged in 1635. Under the terms of its charter, its proprietor, Lord Baltimore, was required to gain the assent of the colony's freemen to any legislation. In the 17th century, a freeman was any male who could vote for representatives to a legislative assembly. At the same time, there emerged throughout the colonies the phenomenon of town meetings that dealt with local interests and needs. Citizens gathered to decide on matters of taxes, education, public law, and charity, and eventually, revolution. In 1638, colonial leader Thomas Hooker opened a town meeting in Connecticut with these prophetic words: "The foundation of authority is laid in the free consent of the people." His belief that all men should have a voice and a vote were in treasonous opposition to monarchy rule. In 1669, the proprietors of the Carolina colonies issued the Fundamental Constitution. Written by John Locke, it laid out a blueprint for government. 118 years later, the United States of America adopted a permanent blueprint for government with the writing of the Constitution. Carolina's Fundamental Constitution was followed in 1680 with William Penn's famous Form of Government, another blueprint, this time stressing limitations on the process of governing. By the beginning of the 18th century, all the English colonies had some form of representative government, a newfound religious tolerance, and institutions of education which produced an intelligentsia that understood the basis of English law, liberty, and property, first expressed in the Magna Carta in 1215 and later clarified in the English Bill of Rights in 1689. What was equally remarkable in these first 100 years is what did not happen. Left largely to themselves by England, the colonies did not become a theocracy, nor were they ruled by dictators or despots, nor did they become colonial fiefdoms granted by English kings. As the 18th century dawned, the benign neglect of the American colonies would come to an end. The English Parliament was determined to take a more active role in governing, but it was too late. Something new for mankind had started, and it could not be stopped. It was a new kind of self-rule by the people, of the people, and for the people.